The evening light settled softly over the eggplant field, brushing everything in a quiet violet-gold haze. Rows of broad green leaves trembled gently in the breeze, and beneath them the ripe eggplants gleamed with that deep, glossy purple that always made the harvest feel especially rewarding. From the far end of the field, Tu Tien walked back slowly with a basket full of freshly picked fruit resting against her hip. The basket was heavy, filled to the brim with round, firm, ripe eggplants, but her steps were steady. On her face was a faint smile, small, tired, but warm enough to make the whole space feel softer around her. Not far away, Jack was sitting silently, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the garden fence, as if he were looking at something no one else could see. The peaceful farm around him seemed unable to calm the storm inside him. In his chest sat a weight he could no longer ignore, a secret tied to the land plot that had fallen into the planning zone. The same land his mother and Ms. Thu had bought with so much trust and hope. The truth had pressed on him for days, and the longer he kept it inside, the more it seemed to hollow him out. When Tu Tien came closer, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. She carefully set the basket down near the porch, brushed a few loose strands of hair away from her forehead, and turned to look at him. Jack did not speak right away. For a brief moment, he just listened to the sounds around them. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds returning home, the faint creak of the bamboo fence in the wind. It was the kind of evening that should have brought peace, but instead it only made his burden feel more obvious. Finally, Jack let out a slow breath and began to speak. His voice was low and steady at first, but beneath that calmness was something heavier, something strained. He told Tu Tien about the land. He told her that the plot had fallen into the planning zone. He told her how deeply worried he was not for himself, but for his mother. More than the money, more than the legal trouble, what tormented him most was the thought of her finding out and being crushed by it. He knew how much hope she had placed in that piece of land. He knew how much trust had been invested in that decision. If the truth came out too suddenly, the shock might hit her harder than the financial loss itself. As Jack spoke, Tu Tien stood still and listened without interrupting. The usual brightness in her eyes faded, replaced by concern so clear that she did not need to say a single word for him to feel it. Her expression softened, and her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the basket as if she, too, were trying to hold herself together. She understood at once that this was not a small problem, not something that could be brushed aside with simple comfort. It was the kind of matter that spread into every corner of a family's life, the kind that could turn one piece of bad news into sleepless nights, silent meals, and endless worry. After a long pause, Tu Tien finally spoke. Her voice was gentle, almost careful, as if she was afraid of making his burden feel heavier. She said that if he needed it, she had a little money saved. It was not much, she admitted that herself, before he could even respond. She knew very well that what she had was probably only a tiny amount compared to what was needed. Just a drop in the ocean, but even so, she wanted to help. She did not want to stand by and watch him shoulder everything alone. To her, helping was not about whether the amount was big enough to fix the problem. It was about standing beside him when he needed someone most. Jack turned to look at her then, really look at her, and something in his expression shifted. The tension in his eyes remained, but there was also gratitude there, quiet and deep. He thanked her sincerely, not out of politeness, but with the kind of gratitude that comes when a person feels truly understood. He told her that in his heart he already considered her someone close in the family. That was why he did not want to hide anything important from her. He did not want her to hear about it from someone else. He did not want there to be distance or secrets between them, especially not over something this serious. Then, with a tone firmer than before, Jack assured her that he had a way to handle it. It would not be easy, and it would come with sacrifice. But he had already made up his mind. He did not explain every detail yet, but there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he had been thinking about this for a long time. He was not speaking impulsively. He had already begun preparing himself for what needed to be done. The twilight deepened around them. Somewhere nearby, insects had begun their evening chorus, and the farm slowly slipped into that tender hour between day and night. In that quiet setting, neither of them said anything for a while, but sometimes silence reveals more than words ever could. The worry in Jack's chest had not disappeared. The uncertainty was still there. The problem had not been solved, and yet, in that moment, amid the scent of soil and leaves and the fading light over the field, something unspoken became undeniable. Whatever hardships lay ahead, they were no longer facing them as two separate people. There was anxiety, yes. There was pressure, fear, and the unknown. But woven through all of it was a deep attachment neither of them could deny anymore. It was not dramatic. It did not need grand declarations. It lived in small gestures, in the way Tu Tien offered everything she could, even when it was so little, in the way Jack chose honesty instead of silence, in the way both of them instinctively turned toward each other in difficult moments. That quiet bond had become its own kind of strength, a silent place to lean when life became too heavy to carry alone. After a while, Jack rose to his feet. He still had to leave for work. Responsibilities did not pause just because his heart was troubled. But as he stood there, preparing to go, his eyes lingered on Tu Tien with an unmistakable reluctance, as though part of him wished he could stay in that peaceful yard a little longer. There was no dramatic farewell, no long speech, only a brief exchange of looks that carried more emotion than words. In that look was a quiet promise. No matter what burden he had to bear, he would not let it destroy the fragile happiness they had built together. The next scene unfolded in the front yard of the familiar house, a place that had seen countless ordinary days, but now stood witness to something far more painful. Jack quietly let out the one thing that had stayed beside him through so many chapters of life, his longtime companion, the Ford pickup truck. The vehicle was more than a machine to him. It had been there through hard days, through work, through family errands, through moments when he had needed to leave quickly, and moments when he had needed to drive with no destination in mind. It was the last truly valuable thing he still owned. That morning, however, sentiment had no space to win. A buyer had come to see the truck. Jack greeted the man with a calm face and steady voice, but inside, his heart felt as though it were being tightened in a slow, painful grip. He forced himself to stay composed as the buyer moved around the pickup, inspecting it from front to back with the careful eye of someone who knew how to judge value. The man ran his hand along the body, crouched to look at the tires, opened the doors, checked the interior, then asked to start the engine. The familiar sound of that engine turning over made something in Jack's chest twist sharply. He kept his expression neutral, but in his eyes there was a sadness he could not fully hide. The buyer checked the documents, compared details, asked a few more practical questions, and continued examining the vehicle. With meticulous attention, Jack answered everything clearly. He did not rush. He did not bargain recklessly. He handled the conversation with the kind of restraint that only made the pain underneath feel more real. This was not just a transaction. It was a farewell dressed up as business. In the end, they settled on a price, 400 million VND. The figure was enough to give Jack a narrow path forward, enough to create a fragile hope that maybe he could settle the urgent debts, retrieve the savings book for his mother, and keep the worst of the truth from crashing down on her all at once. When the transfer notification came through, the sound felt cold and final. Jack looked down at the screen for a brief second, and it was as if that single chime had sliced cleanly through his last attachment to something that had once made him feel secure. He signed the papers. He handed over the keys, and he did it all with a smile that barely held together. For a split second after the keys left his hand, Jack stood motionless. The buyer said something polite, maybe about completing the registration transfer soon, maybe about the truck still being in good condition, but the words barely reached him. All he could hear was the fading hum of the engine, The small mechanical sounds that had once felt familiar and dependable, now drifting farther away from him. He had known this moment was coming. He had prepared himself for it. But knowing did not make it easier. The Ford pickup rolled out through the gate and onto the road, carrying with it years of memories Jack had no time to revisit. He watched until the vehicle disappeared from view, until all that remained was the empty patch of ground where it had stood. The yard suddenly looked bigger, quieter, lonelier. There was a strange hollowness in seeing that space vacant, as though the absence of the truck had exposed the reality of everything he had been trying so hard not to feel. He lowered his gaze to the phone still in his hand. 400 million VND. The number was there, undeniable, clean and precise on the screen. It should have brought some relief, and in a practical sense, it did. That money meant he could move quickly. It meant he still had a chance to deal with the urgent mess before his mother learned how serious things had become. It meant the savings book might be retrieved. It meant some part of the burden could be carried before it crushed the whole family. And yet the sense of gain was inseparable from the sting of loss. What he had received was hope, but hope bought at the cost of something deeply personal. Jack slipped the phone into his pocket and stood in silence for another moment. His hands hung at his sides, then slowly curled into fists before loosening again. He was not the type to collapse into visible grief. He had never allowed himself that luxury. Life had trained him to swallow emotion, to keep moving, to do what had to be done regardless of what it cost. Even now, with his chest tight and his throat dry, he did not let himself linger too long in sorrow. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself, then turned and walked back inside the house. The familiar yard, the doorway, the worn floor beneath his feet. Everything looked the same, yet felt slightly altered, as if the house itself could sense that a small but meaningful chapter had just ended. He placed the paperwork on the table and sat down for a moment, leaning forward with both elbows on his knees. The room was quiet. In that silence, the weight of responsibility returned even more sharply. Selling the truck had only been one step. Painful, necessary, but still only one step. The larger problem remained, waiting for him outside emotion, outside regret, outside sentiment. He began calculating again in his mind, reviewing numbers the way a person touches a bruise just to remind himself it is still there. Debt, the land issue, the money needed to retrieve the savings book, the possibility that one wrong I could unravel everything. His mother's face kept appearing in his thoughts, her trust, her hopes, the way she had probably believed all this time that the family still had some secure ground beneath its feet. Jack clenched his jaw. That was the part he could not bear. Losing money hurt, losing possessions hurt, but watching his mother collapse under grief and disappointment, that was what he was fighting against with everything he had. The transfer amount had given him a chance, nothing more. A chance to buy time. A chance to hold the truth back until he could soften its impact. A chance to stand between the disaster and the people he loved for just a little longer. He understood clearly that one sale would not magically erase all trouble. But at least now he had something in his hands besides helplessness. He rose from the table and splashed water on his face at the sink. The coolness helped only a little. When he looked up at his own reflection, he hardly recognized the tiredness in his eyes. There was determination there, yes, but also a weariness that had been building for far too long. He had been carrying too much in silence. Too many calculations, too many worries, too many decisions that had to be made quickly and alone. Still, there was no room for self-pity. He dried his face, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to keep going. On the road afterward, the absence of the Ford pickup became even more real, whether he sat in another vehicle or simply moved through the day without that old companion beside him. The loss followed him like a shadow. He remembered the steering wheel beneath his palms, the seat molded by years of use, the way the engine responded when he pushed it onto a long stretch of road. That truck had been part of his routine, part of his pride, part of the identity of a man who worked hard and kept things running no matter what. Letting it go had not only been a financial decision, it had felt like giving up the last visible proof that he still had some control over his life. But then another thought rose in him, firmer than regret. What mattered more, a vehicle or his mother's peace of mind? A possession or the chance to protect his family from another wound? Once he framed it that way, the pain remained, but the decision no longer felt uncertain. Sacrifice only becomes unbearable when a person believes it serves no purpose. Jack knew exactly why he had done it. That knowledge did not erase the sorrow, but it gave meaning to it. As he moved through the day, his mind drifted briefly back to the eggplant field, to the dim evening light, to Tu Tien standing there with tired eyes full of concern. Her words had been simple, but they stayed with him. The offer of her small savings, the quiet way she chose to stand beside him, the sincerity in her voice. Those things lingered more strongly than he expected. In the middle of financial pressure and family fear, her presence had become something steady. Not a solution to the problem, not a miracle, but a source of warmth that made the burden feel a little less isolating. Jack realized then that what had hurt him most over the past days was not only the danger of losing money or land. It was the loneliness of carrying too much without knowing whether anyone could truly understand. Yet Tu Tien had understood. She might not have had the means to solve the matter, but she had done something else just as important. She had made it clear he did not have to hide every wound. That kind of closeness was rare. It asked for no grand promise, but it gave strength in ways that practical help sometimes could not. The memory of her face softened something in him. For the first time that day, the knot in his chest eased a little. He thought about how she had smiled despite being tired, how carefully she had listened, how naturally she had placed herself beside his struggle, as though his pain had already become partly hers, in a life where so many things could. Shift, overnight money, land, security, reputation, that quiet loyalty felt precious. Still, sentiment could only accompany him so far. By the time the sun had moved higher and the rhythm of the day pulled him onward, Jack had already returned fully to what needed to be done next. He would use the money carefully. He would resolve the most urgent matters first. He would find a way to retrieve the savings book. He would hold back the full truth from his mother until he could do so without destroying her spirit. He would endure the regret, the inconvenience, the sting of starting over if it meant those he loved would suffer less. That resolve settled inside him with a kind of cold clarity. He no longer had the luxury of wavering. The sale of the truck had drawn a line. Everything after this had to count. Even so, beneath all that determination remained a quiet human ache. When evening approached again and the day began to lose its edge, Jack found himself thinking once more of the moment the buyer drove away. Some losses do not announce themselves loudly. They leave quietly, and only later do you realize how much space they occupied in your life. The truck had been one of those things. Its absence would show up in ordinary ways: in convenience lost, in habits broken, in mornings that felt slightly unfamiliar. And maybe that was why the pain cut deeper than expected. It was not only about value. It was about memory, routine, and a piece of self that had now been traded away for necessity. Yet, if given the same choice again, he knew he would still do it. Because love, when it is real, often disguises itself as sacrifice. It rarely looks noble in the moment. More often, it looks like a man standing in a quiet yard, forcing composure while handing over his last valuable possession. It looks like choosing loss with open eyes, because keeping something for yourself would cost the people you love even more. That was the truth Jack carried now, not dramatic, not poetic, but painfully clear. By the time the sky dimmed once more, his sadness had not disappeared, but it had settled into something steadier. Regret was still there. So was exhaustion. But above both stood determination, solid and unyielding. He would keep moving. He would fix what he could. He would bear what he must. And no matter how heavy the road became, he would not allow this sacrifice to be meaningless. Somewhere ahead lay more difficult conversations, more hard choices, more risks he had yet to face. But for now, he had done one necessary thing. He had cut away a piece of his own comfort to protect the fragile peace of his family. And though the wound of that decision was still fresh, there was also strength in it. A quiet, stubborn strength that came from knowing he had chosen responsibility over attachment, action over despair. Jack moved forward in silence, his hands tightening unconsciously as though still remembering the steering wheel he no longer held. His heart was filled with both resolve and regret, but above all, with the certainty that this pain was not in vain. Whatever happened next, he would carry it. Whatever it cost, he would endure it. Because some sacrifices are not made to save yourself. They are made to shield the people you cannot bear to see hurt. And with that thought anchored firmly inside him, Jack stepped into the next stretch of uncertainty. Not unafraid, not untouched by sorrow, but unwavering,